Alors bonjour collègues.
Good morning, everyone. This is the 20th meeting of our committee. And the third day that we've been sitting this week already. We have a number of witnesses this morning. And they're all appearing by video conference. So none of the witnesses are here in the room with us. They are in Germany and Scotland, respectively. Appearing today from Germany, Professor Joachim Benke, a professor at Zeppelin University in Germany and the chair of the Political Science Department. He has a Master's of Arts in Communication Studies, Economics, and Political Science from the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich. He received this master's in 1990 and since 1991 has worked in academia. Professor Benke makes regular analytical contributions on the topic of electoral law and elections to various large publications, including the Financial Times Germany, Der Spiegel, and Die Zeit. In 2011, he was a witness to the Schleswig-Holstein Parliamentary Legal Committee that was seeking to amend electoral laws of the region. He has also served as witness for parliamentary committees on the Bavarian Constitution and has spoken in Germany's Federal Constitutional Court regarding constitutional challenges to the coalition government's recent election law.
From Germany today is Professor Friedrich Puckelsheim, who is a professor of stochastics at the Institute for Math at the Augsburg University in Germany and chair of the Department of Stochastics at the university. Professor Puckelsheim's research focuses on the mathematical analyses of electoral systems, and he's often invited as a witness to parliamentary committees on electoral law. Professor Puckelsheim is known for having developed an electoral process known as the New Zurich Allocation Method, colloquially referred to as the double Puckelsheim, a system used in 2006 during Zurich's council elections. From England, we have joining us today, and please correct me and forgive me if I don't pronounce your last name properly, Mary Pitcatley?
That's absolutely right.
Pardon me?
It is.
Oh, good.
Yes,
Thank you. Who is the chief executive of Falkirk Council, a local authority responsible for local government functions in Falkirk, and the convener of the Electoral Management Board for Scotland. Miss Pitcatley studied law at Edinburgh University and was the first woman to hold the post of chief executive in 1998, as well as one of the youngest. She has been a representative of local government at a variety of national bodies and is a former member of the Arbuthnot Commission, which was set up to consider boundary differences in voting systems in Scotland. In 2005, Ms. Pitcatley received the Order of the British Empire for her service in local government. Also joining us from the UK is Mr. Andy O'Neill. Monsieur O'Neill dirige la Commission électorale en Écosse.
Mr. O'Neill is the head of the Electoral Commission in Scotland, a post he has held since 2001 rather. Mr. O'Neill appeared as witness during the Scottish Affairs Committee, focused on the referendum on separation for Scotland. And finally, Mr. Chris Highcock.
To the EMB, which stands for the Electoral Management Board for Scotland. So he, he supports the EMB's policy and strategic work and is key liaison between it and Scotland's 32 returning officers and 15 EROs. He engages with governments, the Electoral Commission, and various suppliers to ensure stakeholders understand the requirements of the electoral administrators. As Senior Deputy Returning Officer for the City of Edinburgh, he oversees the capital's delivery of elections and referendums. So thank you so much again to all of you for being here. And the way we work is, as We have for the first group from Germany, it's 20 minutes for presentations, and as for the second group from the UK. And so you will go through your presentations, and then the committee will have 2 rounds of questions. And in each round, each member, and we have 11 members asking questions, each member will have 5 minutes for a Q&A session, and there will be 2 rounds of this. So, and I would just remind you that if we get to the end of the 5 minutes and you haven't been able to fully answer a question, it doesn't mean that you can't address it the next time the floor is yours. So not to worry about that. So we'll start with Professor Benkei, please.
So can you hear me?
Yes.
Do you? Okay. So, a central theme in the committee's inquiry into the system for the election of the members of the House of Commons is a problem of proportional representation of political parties. Hitherto, members of parliament are elected in single-seat constituencies. However, parliament's daily work relies on party affiliation, not on regional prominence. This mismatch has been the cause of many debates and initiatives for electoral reform. Similar electoral issues have been encountered in German history. Based on the German experience, we sketch some ideas that possibly aid in identifying feasible solutions for the Canadian problems. In section 2, we give a short review of the essentials of the electoral system for the German Bundestag. In section 3, we turn to the Canadian House of Commons and sketch a hypothetical electoral system, tagged SNP and PRP, that we view to be a natural enhancement of the current single-member plurality system. I begin with section 2. I'm very pleased to appear here as witness and to introduce to you the main features of the German electoral system. The double vote system for the election of the members of the Bundestag has become something like a democratic export hit. In contrast to other export hits like German diesel cars, it has caused no considerable mischief. Quite the contrary, it is held in high regard. Without doubt, this esteem is not undeserved, but there are at least some precautions you should take when implementing the German system. To explain the system as a whole would be a very demanding task, because the current German system is one of the most complicated systems in the world. But this is valid only for the way it works, not for the way it is executed. Furthermore, the complex intricacies of the German system are mostly due to its federal structure and the specific way the German system is adapted to that. Although Canada is also a federal state, due to constitutional constraints, especially the fixed numbers of seats for every province, the one-to-one transfer of the German electoral system to the context of Canada is probably not possible. The only solution we could imagine, therefore, consists in the application of the system within each province separately. This is also the way it was used in the first German federal election in 1949. The separate application within each province makes things much easier. Therefore, I will concentrate on the main features of the German electoral system only. In the literature, the German system is often referred to as a mixed-member proportional system. The key point is its combination of 2 ballots, which are used at 2 different tiers: the direct and personal election of candidates in single-member districts and the voting for party lists in an upper tier, which is big enough to ensure that the proportional distribution of seats between the parties can be guaranteed. The intention was to maintain the proportional system of the Weimar Republic, but to complement it with the advantages of directly elected local representatives, to which the citizens could establish a special personal relationship. In the German electoral system, each citizen has 2 votes. With the first vote, the Erststimme, the voter selects one of the candidates in his constituency. With a second vote, Zweitstimme, the voter votes for so-called Landesliste, which is a party list for one of the 16 Länder of the Federal Republic of Germany. For better understanding, I will refer to the second vote in the following, sometimes as the party vote. One half of the seats in the German Bundestag are constituency seats, which are attributed to the candidates who have won the plurality of first votes in the constituency. The second half are list seats. Only those parties which have won more than 5% of all valid second votes or have won at least 3 constituency seats are entitled to participate in the proportional distribution of seats according to the Sainte-Laguë procedure. We can skip, for reasons of simplicity, the complex distribution of seats between the Länder. What's important is the fact that in the end each party is entitled to a certain number of seats according to its share of party votes. From that amount, the number of constituency seats that the party gained in that land is subtracted. The remaining seats are distributed according to the rank in the Landesliste. Persons on the list who have already won a constituency seat are not considered, so it is possible that the number of constituency seats achieved in one land is higher than the number to which the party list is entitled. Such seats are called surplus seats or overhang seats. As long as there are no overhang seats, the distribution of seats between the parties is, depending on rounding effects and the effective threshold, more or less proportional. The linkage between the single-member district tier and the upper tier of the land guarantees that the whole number of seats of a party, including the constituency seats it has won, is covered by its second votes. Thus, usually the first votes are only important in regard to the personal occupation of seats. They are, with the exception of the emergence of surplus seats, irrelevant for the number of seats that a party gains. The whole purpose of this linkage between the two tiers is to correct for violations of proportionality which occur in the course of the distribution of seats in the single-member districts. As mentioned, the situation is more complicated when overhang seats emerge. These are seats for which the appropriate price in party votes is not raised, so proportionality is violated. One possible solution to restore proportionality could be to enhance Parliament till the overhang seats are covered by the proportionally distributed seats for the parties. This solution is applied in all electoral laws of the German Bundesländer, which also have mixed-member proportional systems, and since 2012 it is also valid for the federal electoral law. This solution is obviously not available if the size of parliament is fixed. In this case, restoring proportionality isn't possible as long as the gain of a constituency seat is guaranteed. But it would certainly violate fundamental considerations of fairness to deny the winner of a plurality of first votes his constituency seat. So some deviations from perfect proportionality may be the necessary price for preserving the principle of direct representation by personally elected MPs in the single-member districts. But at least this price should be not higher than is required by the wish to satisfy our taste for fairness. So the best response to that problem consists in the attempt to prevent the creation of overhang seats whenever possible. Sometimes overhang seats are the consequence of the structure of the party system. Since this is a materialization of voter preferences, it cannot be manipulated. But some overhang seats are created by strategic voting, especially by ticket splitting, which occurs if the first vote is given to a candidate who is not the candidate of the party to which the second vote is given. These overhang seats can simply be avoided by abolishing the two-vote system. Then the voters have only one vote, which they cast for candidates in their constituency. The party votes, which are the base for the proportional distribution of seats, are calculated by summing up all personal votes for constituency candidates. This system was also used in 1949 for the BRD and is still used in Baden-Württemberg. This would also have the nice advantage that parties have an especially strong incentive to nominate attractive candidates. Mr. Pugelsheim will now continue with the presentation.
Since Confederation in 1867, members of the House of Commons have been elected using the single-member plurality system, which has its focus on constituency representation. On the other hand, when Parliament convenes, it is not local representation that is dominant, but party affiliation. However, the number of seats a party holds in the House visibly is at odds with the support the party enjoys in the electorate. With our German background, we propose to rectify this representational mismatch by enhancing current provisions in the direction of a system implementing single-member plurality combined with proportional representation of parties. The Canadian Constitution includes detailed rules to determine how many members of the House of Commons are assigned to each province and territory. In electoral jargon, these seat guarantees are referred to as district magnitudes. In order to meet the constitutionally mandated district magnitudes, our hypothetical system allots seats separately per province and territory. Hence, our model calls for 13 separate seat apportionments. The 13 apportionment calculations are split into two categories. The first category assembles the districts with a district magnitude too small for proportionality to take effect. The second category comprises the other districts. In first category districts, we propose to maintain the single-member plurality system as is. The three territories belong to the first category because they command just one seat each. Evidently, a single seat is insufficient to achieve any degree of proportionality whatsoever. As a matter of fact, for proportionality to function properly, theoretical investigations recommend that the district magnitude should meet or exceed twice the number of participating parties. Therefore, we also place Prince Edward Island with 4 seats in the first category and Newfoundland and Labrador with 7 seats. Whether to do so or not is a political decision. If so, the already large constituencies do not have to be enlarged yet further, which is good. On the other hand, the votes that are not cast for constituency winners are wasted, which is bad. In summary, first category districts enjoy the same electoral system as in the past. For the 8 provinces in the second category, the old single-member plurality system is enhanced by proportional representation of parties. In order to set some seats aside for the system's proportionality component, we propose to reduce the number of constituencies. Of course, it is a genuinely political decision to fix the number of constituencies per province. As for us, for our hypothetical model, we choose to roughly halve the number of constituencies, for instance, by merging 2 into 1. Then, about half of the seats are filled by way of single-member constituencies, and the other half from party lists. Specifically, in the last 2 elections, our model apportions the district magnitude among parties using the method, the Sainte-Laguë method, as it is known in New Zealand and in continental Europe, or Webster method in the Anglo-Saxon world, or from a more systematic point, the divisor method with standard rounding, because it functions in the following way. A party's vote count is divided by an electorate key, that's the divisor, and the ensuing quotient is rounded to yield the party's seat number. For example, in 2015 in British Columbia, every 56,000 votes justified roughly one seat, and roughly reminds us that the quotients have to be rounded. All resulting seat numbers for the parties happen to meet or exceed the number of constituencies won by a party in a province in the last two elections. That is, in every instance, there are enough seats for constituency winners. Any additional seats beyond constituency seats are filled from closed party lists. Closed lists encourage parties to promote social cohesion and to include underrepresented groups. Generally, the legal provisions should codify not the ordinary divisor method with standard rounding, but its direct seat-restricted variant. The variant inhibits the occurrence of overhang seats and thereby ensures adherence to the constitutionally mandated district magnitudes. The direct seat variant imposes minimum restrictions which the ordinary method neglects. A party is allotted at least as many seats as are needed for its constituency winners. In cases when the minimum restriction becomes active, the required seats are transferred from the competing parties to those parties that feature an excess number of constituency winners. That is, proportional representation is compromised in favor of constituency representation. Finally, we address the question of which vote pattern to use. The answer is as simple as can be. Nothing changes. Voters are issued ballot sheets with the old design they are accustomed to. Every voter casts a single vote that is a composite appreciation of eligibility of a person and preference for a party. Our proposal only changes the law's scheme of evaluating the information supplied. In second category provinces, where the old system is enhanced by proportional representation of parties, every vote is tallied twice, once for the candidate towards constituency plurality, and once for the party towards district-wide proportionality. The essential novelty which people need to understand is that now their votes are more carefully evaluated by the law by lending particular weight to party affiliation. At this juncture, every vote counts. In our brief, we illustrate our hypothetically proposed system by applying it to the last two general elections. Our proposal is seen to achieve more proportionality among parties than the status quo. Due to its hybrid character, it does not coincide with pure proportionality, though, but preserves much of the charm of past traditions. Thank you very much for your attention. Back to the new world.
Thank you very much. And through the magic of modern communications, we will now go to Scotland. Who will be starting in the UK? Will it be Ms. Pitcatley?
It's me, Mr. O'Neill. I'm going to do the whole presentation to
Wonderful.
make it on behalf of. Great. Okay, well, firstly, thank you for inviting us to give evidence to your committee. My purpose is to provide a brief presentation which we hope will stimulate some questions afterwards. I'll seek to very briefly explain who we are and what we do. I'll then seek to explain Scotland's electoral systems and the 4 voting methods that we use, explain how we managed to finish up with 4 different electoral systems, and then raise some issues which might be of interest to you in your deliberations, which have come up as we've sought to administer various elections in Scotland. So, firstly, who is the EMB, the Electoral Management Board for Scotland, and the Electoral Commission? I don't intend to spend too much time on this. Slides 1 to 8 of our presentation are really there for information, but I would probably point out to you the following salient points, because we administer elections slightly differently than you do in Canada. Neither the EMB or the Electoral Commission run elections in Scotland. I think that's important to note. That's the job of the individual 32 returning officers, of which Mary is also one. The Electoral Management Board seeks to coordinate returning officers during their administration of elections. Mary, as convener of the Electoral Management Board, has a power of direction for local government elections and recommends courses of action in other elections, such as a common issue date for postal votes across the whole of Scotland. We, the Commission, where we provide advice to governments on electoral law and guidance to returning officers and electoral registration officers. We register the political parties who campaign. We seek to ensure that candidates, agents and parties understand the financial rules within which they campaign. We administer the Observers Scheme for observers at elections, and we also seek, through public awareness activity, to ensure that voters know how to register and know how to vote, which is important, of course, because we have 4 different electoral systems. Both our organisations seek to put the interests of the voter first in what we do by thinking about our actions, how they will impact on the voter, and ensuring that they impact in a positive way. So, turning to slide 10, which briefly lays out Scotland's 4 main elections, which we use a different electoral system at each. The Scottish Parliament, established in 1999, has 129 members, uses the additional member system, MMP to everyone else in the world apart from the Welsh, but we call it EMS. It's a combination of first past the post and a closed party list using the modified D'Hondt system of calculation. For our 32 councils, we use single transferable vote to elect our 1,223 councillors in 353 multi-member wards. The UK House of Commons uses first past the post, and the European Parliament in Scotland, well in the UK, we elect 73 members through a closed list. Scotland elects 6 members. Turning to slide 11, very briefly, we have 4.2 million electors in Scotland. We estimate that 86% of the eligible electorate is currently registered, and a recent innovation in Scotland, 16 and 17-year-olds now can vote in Scottish Parliament and local government elections. Turning to slide 12, very briefly, I don't intend to talk about the UK Parliament electoral system because you understand that it's first past the post. For the European Parliament election, the 6 MEPs elected in Scotland are all elected for the whole of Scotland. Scotland is an electoral region for that election. We use a single X on a closed list, and we use pure D'Hondt to allocate the seats. Turning to the Scottish Parliament election, which was first elected in 1999, on slide 14, we have 129 members, 73 constituency seats elected by first past the post, that's 57% of the seats, and 56 regional seats, 7 members elected in each of the 8 regions which Scotland is divided into. We use an X on 2 ballot papers, 1 X on each ballot paper, and there is a maximum number of 12 names on a regional list. If you turn to slide 15, is a representation of the 2 ballot papers. The lilac ballot paper is the constituency ballot paper. You use an X to vote for whichever candidate you have. On Scottish ballot papers, you would see the candidate's name, the party and description underneath, and not on this, but there is also an emblem or a logo next to the box in which you put your X. On the region, you can stand as an independent or an individual on the regional list. Individuals appear at the bottom alphabetically, and parties appear above the independents, and they also appear alphabetically. We use 2 separate ballot papers, unlike, I believe, in Germany, or correct me if I'm wrong, in New Zealand. We did try a joint ballot paper in 2007. I think it's fair to say poor design issues led to an increase in the rejected votes on that occasion, and politicians decided we wouldn't use the combined ballot paper again, so we went back to 2 individual sheets of paper in 2011. On slide 16, we've shown you a calculation for the regional list, how the seats are allocated under modified D'Hondt, which is essentially the connection between the constituency and the regional votes is the number of seats a party wins in that electoral region is added to 1 to create the divisor. So, for instance, in the representation, Party 1 has won 2 constituency seats, so its divisor is 3, and that carries through. You then do simple division, and the one who's got the most votes is allocated the first seat until you've allocated all 7. As you gain a seat, your divisor goes up 1. Turning to slide 17, for Scottish council elections, we have since 2007 used single transferable vote to elect the 32 councils. Again, we have 353 multi-member wards. The number of seats elected per ward varies. It's on the face of the bill. It was a very contentious issue during the passage of the bill in the Scottish Parliament. You either have 3 or 4 member wards, which are, I think people who would argue STV is the best electoral system would probably argue you need more seats per multi-member ward, but politicians decided that it would be 3 or 4 in Scotland. And you vote, if you turn to slide 18, there's a representation of the Scottish ballot paper. You vote your preferences, 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. You don't have to vote for all candidates. You can stop your preferences whenever you want, and we tested that ballot paper with electors before it was used, and it was seen that the instructions were very important. It is the only electoral system we use in Scotland where numbers are used. So when we first brought it in, the concern, because it was held on the same day as a EMS election, we were using X's as well as numbers. So we spent a lot of time making sure electors understood the difference. We used to count STV the weighted inclusive Gregory method, which we count electronically. It is thought that it would take us possibly 2 days to manually count a weighted inclusive Gregory STV election. Our colleagues in Northern Ireland manually count elections, which they use STV for, and they regularly go into the second day. But the Scottish Government agreed to fund the e-counting project. The system is common throughout all of Scotland. There are 32 count centres. The system isn't connected, they're individually set up, but it's the same system throughout Scotland to ensure consistency. Slides 20 and 21 is an explanation of how STV works, and I didn't intend to go into it, although my colleagues who administer the elections are happy to answer questions. I thought I'd move swiftly on to slide 22 and try and seek to explain as to why Scotland has 4 different electoral systems. Essentially, it's rather obvious, but it's the decision of politicians and government. Mary, Chris and myself's job is to advise on the workability of the electoral systems we employ. It's not our decision to decide which one's best. In fact, we don't have any views. For the 4 systems, the UK Parliament has always used first past the post. It's an act of the UK Parliament. For the European elections, member states agreed in the 70s that it had to be a proportional system, and the UK Parliament in the 70s passed an act which required the use of a closed list. And I think at the time that was seen as very important because it used an X, the same as first past the post, and they simply voted once. Turning to the Scottish Parliament, why do we use the additional member system? It's widely accepted in Scotland that the desire amongst politicians was to maintain the constituency link with voters, so they were very keen to ensure that constituency seats still existed. It was also thought that the use of X's was important because it was familiar to the electorate. Why we finished up with that was the Scottish Constitutional Convention, which was a cross-party civic society organisation which existed in the 1980s and 90s, suggested the use of AMS, which led to the document Scotland's Parliament, Scotland's Right, which was published in 1992 ahead of a UK parliamentary election at that time, which suggested it. When the Labour government of 1997 came in, they passed the Scotland Act 1998, which brought in AMS, which we first used in 1999. And finally, we finished up with STV for council elections, which is a departure from X's. Essentially, the story behind that is the Mackintosh Commission on Local Government and Scottish Parliament relations proposed the use of proportional representation in 1999. The Working Group on Renewing Local Democracy, known as the Curley Committee, then suggested in 2000 that we consider a single transferable vote. There then occurred in 2003 a Scottish Parliament election. The negotiations between the coalition partners of the Labour Party and the Liberal Democrats agreed to introduce a single transferable vote. I think it was considered to be a deal breaker for the Liberal Democrats, who are very pro-STV at that time, which led to the Local Governance Scotland Act 2004 and our first use of STV in 2007. And we then thought we would highlight some issues which you might want to consider as part of your deliberations. Firstly, we would say that whatever you do, change needs time, planning, resources and testing to be successful. Well, you would expect that. We're a bunch of bureaucrats after all. However, we did have a period of major change, I think it's fair to say, in the period 2005 through to 7, which we did then suffer from some local difficulties in our elections. I think it's commonly accepted that too much change was brought in too short a period of time, and which led to rejection rates higher than we would normally expect, and the e-counting system didn't work quite as we expected it. It essentially broke down on the night in certain places. So we would argue that testing, particular with voter-facing materials such as, of course, the ballot paper, is very important. Make sure what you're giving the voter works, and good guidelines, and something which the Electoral Commission produced post that 2007 event, that we produced Making Your Mark guidelines to explain how we think a good ballot paper should be designed and then tested. And I think one of the things which also came out of 2007 was, don't be driven by process, you have to put the voter first, so the needs of the machinery for e-counting are secondary to the needs of the electorate. And I think we would say that in the sense that in two of our electoral regions in 2007, at the very last moment, because of the size of paper which the counting machines needed to use, the instructions to voters at the top of the ballot paper was reduced. This led in those two regions to an increase of 2% over the Scottish average for rejected votes. So certainly that's something we learned, and in 2011 it didn't happen. We would also suggest that you consider the size of your constituencies. Certainly the 6 MEPs who represent Scotland are widely thought to find it difficult to connect with their electorate. They literally represent the whole of Scotland, whilst a small country, a relatively big place, and to try and connect with 4 million electors. Under single transferable vote, you of course as an elector get 3 or 4 councillors to represent you, and that can be seen as a bonus, as a positive. But it also means in our remote rural areas, councillors also have to represent very large areas of several islands, which generally have but not always have ferry connections. So you have to think about the size of the wards. The Curley Committee suggested 2-member wards in certain remote areas. Lord Steele, way back in the 60s, recommended that if you were going to reduce STV, you could consider single-member wards in very remote rural areas. It's fair to say neither of those proposals have been brought into legislation yet, but that's an option for trying to get away from the problem of remoteness from your electorate. There's also some other issues which surround single transferable vote, and these are, I should say, these aren't the views and opinions of the Electoral Commission, the UK Electoral Commission. This is taken from a paper Professor John Curtis of Strathclyde University, who's a famous commentator, psephologist in Scotland and the UK. There is issues which we have noticed of alphabetic bias identified by academics in 2007, and we know this of course because we have e-counting, so there is data available in an anonymous form after the event which people can then analyse. In the first STV election in 2007, around 60% of all voters gave their first preference to a candidate higher on the ballot paper than the candidate for whom they gave their second preference. And also it was found that if a party nominated more than one candidate in a ward, then the voter was more likely to vote for the party candidate higher up the ballot paper than the second party candidate, and that happened 80% of the time in the 2012 Scottish local government elections. However, of course, that doesn't always happen. If you're a well-known or an incumbent candidate, they in 2012 did go against that trend. Politicians in Scotland are aware of this and are considering solutions to this. Solutions talked about are rotating, Robson's rotation, the candidates on the ballot paper so they appear equally in all positions. They are considering bracketing party candidates together and perhaps also rotating them within the bracket so all party candidates appear in different places. The Commission doesn't have an opinion on that. What we've said is you have to consider two things. Voters are used to seeing ballot papers with candidates laid out alphabetically, see the effect of changing that, and in general you should test any ballot paper before you give it to the electorate. So we recommend that you test it first, test a voter-facing product. We also think you might want to consider do voters, whilst filling in the ballot paper, fully understand an electoral system? For instance, under EMS in Scotland...
Mr. O'Neill, we have about one minute left before we go to the round of questions.
Okay.
And the members will be able to explore in greater detail the points in your presentation. Would you like to take a minute to wrap up?
I'll just finish up. Yeah. Okay, the issue of second vote strategies, which my German colleague talked about, is ticket splitting, which I'll not talk about. The other issue under STV is about 13% in 2012 and 20% in 2007 voters only expressed a single preference, and many of them we see, because we see them being counted, with single X's. And how we seek to deal with that is through public awareness campaigns, and the final presentation slides, 27 through to the end, explain how the Commission undertakes that, and we use that. We provide public leaflets to households, we do TV, radio ads, we do a lot of partnership working with people who we identify as connected to people who are likely to need information on how to register and how to vote. I'll stop at that.
Thank you so much. So we'll go to our first round of Q&A, and we'll start with Ms. Romanato for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, and I'd like to thank our esteemed colleagues from across the pond for their presentations this morning. A lot of information to digest first thing in the morning. So my first question is actually going to be to our professors in Germany. I just want to make sure I understand the proposed model for Canada. So I'm going to take my home province of Quebec that currently has 78 seats. And in your model, if we were to divide it into two, that'd be 39 districts. Separating those out, I don't know if it'd be 20 would end up being direct vote districts, and the other 19, because there's an uneven number, would end up being the party lists. So my question is, because it's a closed list, half of the population of Quebec wouldn't actually be having a voice on who actually got elected from the party, if I understand that correct. Is that correct?
All of the electorate contribute to the party votes, and so all of the electorate contributes to the successes of the parties.
Okay. And in terms of the two types of MPs, as we would call them, you mentioned two different tiers: the upper tier and the lower tier. Would that constitute sort of a different kind of model in our House of Commons? For instance, we'd have like a lower tier of MPs and then a middle tier or a higher level tier of MPs, the ones that are party. I'm trying to figure out how it would actually work in practice and who would do what.
In Germany, it works in practice that members of parliament are members of parliament. There's no difference in their functions, and there's no difference in access to financing and political positions. The difference is when in the understanding that half of them directly represent a constituency. The other half, of course, also lives in some constituency, and they are very active and keen to give a good performance in the constituency, although they do not have the plurality, the status of being the plurality winner in that constituency. But they are active, they are maintaining office hours, visit associations, and try to be visible. So in Germany, the political everyday work is very similar between both types of representatives.
I think it depends on culture, because in Germany we only know this kind of system. So we never had a system in which we had only constituency seats, only members of constituency seat winners. So the members of the small parties, they are always list members. And they certainly would be not happy about being members of a second class or something like that. And I know if you talk about with Greens about the special relationship with the constituency candidates, they are not so, how should I say it, not so amused about it. The point is, most list members or most list seat members, they are also, or in many cases, they are also constituency candidates, but they have lost in their constituency. But they have a special relationship to the constituency, and so they are known, and they have an office in the constituency, and so they can approach. In reality, the people have more than one member in parliament they can approach if they want to go directly to one of the member of the parliaments.
Okay, so the members appear on, or some of them can appear on both lists, the constituency list and the party list. So if they don't win in the constituency, they could still be named on the party. Is that correct?
That is correct, and that's the normal case.
Okay. Now, how would it work in
30 seconds.
How would it work in terms of our regions? We have very large regions compared to our urban centers.
That's
the
true.
rural areas
the
compared to-
constituency, the boundary condition will have to draw up new boundaries for the constituencies. That's true.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We'll go to Mr. Reid now, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses. Both presentations were excellent, but I'm going to confine my questions to Professors Benke and Puckelsheim to follow up on the model you've proposed. First of all, let me say this. This is a very impressive paper. You should consider publishing it in an academic journal. I think it would meet with the standards of most political science journals. I wanted to ask about the compromise that I think you have been trying to incorporate in your model as you apply Germany's model to certain practical considerations that exist in Canada. Of course, in Canada, we have this very inflexible requirement that the number of seats in each province be fixed, and there's no room for adjustment to that without an amendment to the Constitution. So as I understand it, what you've done is you've said we have on the one hand, we have the problem that in Germany and also in New Zealand is dealt with through overhang seats. And on the other hand, we have a goal of achieving as much proportionality as possible so that the total number of seats for each party in each province accurately reflects the proportion of the vote that was cast for that party on the party list vote. And so what you've done is you have gone in the direction of saying when we face this conflict of proportionality versus every constituency seat being allocated to the person who wins it, we have veered in favor, or we've chosen in favor of the seats, not in favor of proportionality. I assume that the way you've compromised with this is you've made the number of list seats as high as possible. It can only go as high as 50%, I think, under any version of the MMP model, and you've gone right to the largest number in order to deal with that. Is that why the constituencies are only 50% of the total number of seats per province?
That's an entirely political decision which you, our Parliament, has to take, how many constituencies you want to have. In our sample calculation, we took half and half, because in Germany we have roughly half and half, but there are other countries which have 60% to 40%. And one has to look at the data, look at past elections of what is feasible for Canada and what is best. But the decision which is best is not ours, is yours.
Right. I appreciate that very much. Let me rephrase the question, because I was not asking you to make a political statement here. Let me try it this way. If one has 50% of the seats as list seats in each province, versus having, say, only a third of the seats being list seats, am I correct that this is more likely to produce a proportional result given the constraint we have in Canada that you cannot create overhang seats?
Yes, you are correct.
Okay. The problem is the greater the share of the constituency seats, the greater the probability that you have overhang seats.
Yes.
So, for example, if you can win with, and this depends on the structure of the party system, and you have a more or less fragmentized party system, so the biggest party is, say, has about 30% and is possible to win almost all constituency seats. So, if you have more than 30% of constituency seats, this party would have overhang seats. So it depends what you expect is the share of votes that the biggest party can will reach or will achieve. So in Germany we have usually 50-50 division. And this was not a problem until 1990, till unification, because the biggest party they had always about 45 or 50% of the second votes. So even if they got all constituency seats, there were no overhang seats. But with a new party system after unification, because we had a strong leftist party in the eastern German Länder, you could also win with 35% of the votes almost all direct seats, constituency seats. So you would have 50% of all seats with only 35% of the votes. And so the number of overhang seats increased dramatically since 1990.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Cullen now.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you to our guests. This is incredibly informative. I share my colleagues' admiration for your work. One question to our friends from Scotland. In terms of that percentage between first past the post and the proportional seats, I think you had it at 57-43, if I'm not mistaken. How was that decision made? Was it based on some research, or was it simply a political decision?
This was a political decision. It was entirely the decision of the Parliament, but it was based on the intention that the new Parliament would be proportional, but without going as far as 50-50. When they set up the Welsh Assembly, they went for a slightly different percentage between constituency and list seats. So it's purely a decision of politicians.
Thank you, and I'd like to get a sense of the sequence of time. The Act was passed in 1998, and that brought in this new proportional system, and you ran an election, if I'm not mistaken, in 1999 under that system. Is that right?
We did, and we'd had a referendum to determine whether there was a parliament in 1997, so it was a very hectic period of time, but it's a time of very fast-moving process of devolution. So yes, we did have the legislation in 1998. and we then had to run the election in May of 1999.
Wow.
It actually went very well. There were no issues. We had to do a fair amount of voter education, as we sometimes call it, but informing the voter about the type of system that there was, trying not to get too bogged down for the voter in how we would then count those votes and allocate the seats, because as you can see from the slide in here, it's relatively complex. My experience is that most voters are content to leave that to us, but the information that the Commission was giving out was very much about how the voter would vote and what the voter needed to understand about how the new Parliament would be constituted. If I could just go back for a second to the previous question about the status of the two different sets of MSPs, members of the Scottish Parliament. It was an issue for us in the first election. There certainly was a bit of a status issue, and the constituency MSPs were held to have a slightly higher standing than the regional list MSPs, but that very quickly was ironed out, and very quickly all the parties were making statements to confirm that every MSP was to be regarded as having exactly the same standing and the same status. So that needed a political statement.
So that's interesting to me. So in the current status right now, there isn't a political party in Scotland that suggests that there are two classes. It doesn't break down under any partisan lines. And in terms of the Scottish voters' perspective, they don't perceive two classes of representation?
No, absolutely not. As I say, it was an issue, and it was actually quite helpful that surfaced quite quickly, and we were able to be very explicit about that. But it required the major parties, particularly, to make those statements and to make it absolutely clear that they regarded their MP, their MSPs, regardless of how they had been elected, as having the same status. And so, and I suppose we've, in some of the parliaments, Labour has been the main party. In other parliaments it's been the Scottish National Party. Everybody is entirely clear that it doesn't matter how you're elected, whether you're a constituency MSP or you represent a wider region, you've got the same standing.
So that's helpful. Last couple of questions. One around that question of complexity. Sometimes those that are seeking status quo will suggest that complexity will overwhelm the voter and there'll be mass hysteria and it's terrible consequences. The education component is to walk the voter through not only how they vote, but how their vote will be represented in Parliament. That's the focus, as opposed to the complexity of how the votes are then tabulated. And so my question, first off, is there a level of confidence with how those votes are tabulated? Do any of the political actors try to take a shot at that piece, suggesting unfairness? And my second question is around size of constituency. My riding right now in northern British Columbia is 4 times the size of Scotland. So there's sometimes concerns of any system that would enlarge for rural representation to make it even larger still. How has Scotland gotten around that? So those two questions are my final ones.
Very briefly, please.
Sorry, Chair.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. On the first point in relation to understanding, I wouldn't suggest that everybody has a deep understanding of how the D'Hondt method works or the weighted inclusive Gregory method works, but people have a level of trust in it because we've explained it to those who want to know, mainly the academics and some journalists, I have to say, and the public has as much information available to them as they choose to access, because it's all out there available to be seen. And the biggest thing that we've been able to do through electronic counting is to make all of that information available, not just what the totals were, but how people voted, who they gave their first preference to, who they gave their second preference to, etc. So all of that, that's at the local government elections, obviously, but making that level of information available, whatever election it is really important, just to give the voter confidence that, it's all done properly and correctly.
Okay, thank you. We'll have to go to Mr. Thériault now.
Merci. Alors, Madame, Messieurs, je vous remercie.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your generous and rigorous contributions. Mr. Benke, Mr. Puckelstein, I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing your names. In your brief, You mentioned that we might have to reduce the number of ridings. I understand that it's still hypothetical. In Quebec, we tried to implement an electoral reform based on the German model. And we wanted to reduce 125 ridings to 75. At the time, there were 75 federal ridings in Quebec. And so people thought that was completely logical. However, that ended up representing a trap for us, especially considering that Quebec is a huge area. It can contain France several times over. And people simply didn't want to accept reducing the number of ridings. So, is there a way to do this differently? Not reducing the number of ridings drastically like that, but instead increasing the number of ridings. Would it still be possible to make your model work if, instead of reducing, you augmented the number of ridings? What would be the necessary threshold to ensure that proportionality would be respected and to also respect the area of MNE's ridings?
Puckelsheim, is that?
Yeah. We try to argue from our German experience, which mixes the constituency representation with proportional representation of parties, and which requires that a certain number of seats is available for the proportionality component. Now, if these seats are not available, then I simply cannot see how proportionality can be injected in your system, even not at a low dose. If all seats are filled via constituency plurality, or even more constituencies, I wouldn't know how to do it, other than raising the house size of the parliament. If there are no seats available for proportionality adjustment, then I somehow run out of ideas of what we could suggest.
En fait, ce que je voulais savoir.
What I wanted to know was if there are 78 ridings, you can't divide that by 2. That would be too drastic of a change. So, according to you, what's the necessary percentage in terms of increasing the number of ridings to reach proportionality?
It's a political decision because it is the question of how much weight you give to constituencies, constituency representation, and how much weight you or your committee or parliament gives to the proportionality component. We can offer sample calculations if you wish, but I cannot give you a certain percentage number answer that you are asking for.
Presque terminé. Merci.
Thank you very much.
With Professors Mackey and Puckelsheim, I note that you've given us a very, very helpful paper in relation to how members of Parliament are elected in the Bundestag. But since, in contrast to our friends from Scotland, you didn't mention how you elect members to the European Parliament. Do German voters, like Scottish voters, have different systems that they utilize at different levels of elections?
Indeed, the election for the European Parliament is a pure list election.
So it's a list system, just like in Scotland. So do voters in Germany, do you have any way of sensing whether they express a preference for one of their electoral systems versus another? Or are they equally comfortable with both?
Well, we have different systems. We have 16 states because we are also a federal republic, and all states' parliaments have electoral systems which are at face value very similar, but when you look at the details, they are different. So there are 16 different systems in each of our 16 states. There is a different system for the Bundestag, there's a different system for the European Parliament. All systems, however, I would subsume under the description of proportional representation combined with the election of persons. But you can mix the two components in a different way, and what we've tried to do of mixing them in a way that we understand is an issue in your committee work or is an issue in Canada right now.
No, and exactly. Were you going to add something?
If you were referring to... Okay, if you were referring to the public, or if they could express a preference for a specific electoral system, some of our electoral systems in the Länder were changed after referenda. But referendas exist in Germany only on the level of the Länder. So there's not the possibility to make a referendum for the Bundestag elections. There is a movement, a civic movement, who tries to change the Bundeslaw to introduce referendums on the level of Bundestag, and certainly there is also the intention to use this referendum for a change in the electoral system. But the changes where this took place are changes they kept in essential the mixed member proportional systems, but they replaced the closed list with open lists.
Okay. Yeah, and turning to our colleagues in Scotland, given the explanation of the 4 different voting systems, and of course the Scottish voters are exposed to the distortions that we experience in Canada through first past the post when you're electing members to the UK Parliament, and then have proportional voting when you're electing your Scottish Parliament. Is there any way that you would have any sense of what Scottish voters, given that they experience single transferable vote, some form of mixed member proportionality, and first past the post, are there opinion polls or ways or surveys that you can assess which ones Scottish voters find most satisfactory?
As part of our statutory duties, we have to report on all elections following the election. We do many things to get information. We do public opinion surveys, and we ask the question, did you find it easy to vote in the polling place or via postal vote? And we regularly get the low 90% saying it's easy to vote and express their preference easily for all 4 electoral systems.
And
so we haven't had a...
Sorry. Continue. I'm sorry. I didn't want to interrupt.
So we haven't actually ever asked which electoral system do you prefer, but they do find all 4 easy enough to fill in if you think of it in terms of completing a ballot paper.
Do you see a difference in levels of voter participation and voter turnout at the 4 different levels? And what are those differences?
Yes, but I think that's got much more... well, for example, we had over 90% voting in our independence referendum, and in a local government election the turnout might be closer to 50%. So it's much more a function of how voters view the specific importance of the election rather than what the system is, though. So I think that, you know, voters will vote more if they think their vote will count more, is our experience. But you know, you can usually tell in advance whether the turnout is going to be very high or not so high, and that's nothing to do with what the system is. One of the other things I would say, though, is another indicator of whether or not voters find it difficult would be the level of rejected papers. and the level of papers that are not accepted into the count, those that are specifically rejected because the voter hasn't managed to cast their vote clearly, is very, very low in Scotland. And at the referendum that we had 2 years ago, fewer than 0.01% of papers were rejected.
Merci.
So people obviously find it relatively straightforward.
Merci. On va passer maintenant à M. De Courcy.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both our presenters in Germany and in Scotland. I'll start with the German experience as it relates to strategic voting, because it was mentioned in the brief submitted. An oft-heard claim here by advocates of different PR systems is that it will do away with the need for voters to vote strategically. We've had plenty of testimony to the contrary, or suggesting rather that the compromise that a voter makes is shifted to a different consideration. I wonder if you can expand on the experience in the German system with strategic voting, or what strategies or compromises or decisions do voters employ, and as a matter of us understanding that and being able to speak to that reality when we tour the country speaking with Canadians about different electoral systems.
To put it rather casually, we understand by strategic voting that a voter will not vote for his favorite party, that is his highest preferred party. Typically, the motive for strategic voting is consists in avoiding a wasted vote. I will concentrate here only on the first votes, because I think this would be also the important part for you. Strategic voting in this case means that a voter will not give his first vote to a candidate who has ostensibly no chance of winning the constituency. The usual pattern is here that supporters of small parties, such as the liberal FDP in Germany or the Greens, will vote for the constituency candidate from a big party which is closest to their own party and the desired coalition party. Whether this pattern of strategic voting is desired or not depends on the electoral system and on the normative beliefs you have. But the empirical consequences are certainly that. The point is, it is possible that you can induce overhang seats by this kind of ticket splitting and strategic voting. And this means that a coalition can enhance its share of seats it will get by steering some of its voters to this ticket splitting. And this was a main problem in Germany since 1990, and obviously it increased in the last elections. There's also a case in Albany that had dramatically influence, because suggest, or you could, you have to imagine, you could, for example, you could just found a party named the Friends of Conservatives, and then you give an invitation, a recommendation that the supporters of Conservatives should vote with their first vote for the Friends of Conservatives and with the second vote for the real Conservative Party. This would mean that the votes, that the constituency seats which are won for the Friends of the Conservative Party cannot be accounted with the party votes for the Conservative Party. And this would create a huge potential of overhang seats. And so this is a reason why we would recommend that you take only the one vote solution.
Thank you very much. And in Scotland, is there any I guess lessons learned on the way that voters make strategic decisions when they go to the ballots, particularly in the Scottish Parliament system, but not exclusive of the others?
I think in Scotland we don't have overhang seats under AMS, or our version of AMS, so it's slightly different. Split voting, which our German colleagues talked about, is called here second vote strategies. Some parties, we've just gone through a Scottish Parliament election in May, the biggest party, the Scottish National Party, argued both votes SNP because that was in their interests. the Scottish Green Party, which doesn't stand in constituencies, it only stands, apart from one or two places, in the regional lists, would argue second vote Green. So does some of the smaller parties, because they believe it to their advantage, whereby they tend to suggest to the electorate that you aren't going to win for your seat, for your party in the regional list. You won't get any regional members, so you should vote for us because we're your second choice.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks very much. We'll go to Mr. Richards, please.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Mr. O'Neill, some questions for you. Obviously, in your role with the Electoral Commission, you I'm sure have overseen a number of referenda on different topics, correct?
We've had a few, yes.
How, with legislation governing referenda, how does it work? Is there a single piece of legislation that governs referenda in the UK, or when each referendum is held, does it require a standalone piece of legislation to set up for the referendum, or how does that work?
There is PPERA, the Political Parties Elections and Referendums Act, which sets up the UK Electoral Commission in 2000. It essentially, for UK referendums, either across the whole of the UK or in part of it, the chair of the Electoral Commission is the Chief Electoral Officer. Chief Counting Officer. The rules and everything else and the financial regulation which come with that referendum, including the question and the testing, all come in a separate act of the UK Parliament. And that is bespoke to each individual referendum. So the Brexit vote, which we had in June, had a single bit of legislation. Of course, Scotland is slightly different. The independence referendum, which took place in 2014, was a creature of the Scottish Parliament following a deal between the UK and Scottish Government, whereby the Scottish Parliament was allowed to legislate under what was known as the Edinburgh Agreement for that referendum. Mary, on that occasion, was the Chief Counting Officer for the independence referendum, and all the rules which related to it were in that particular act, and that gave us, as the UK referendum, a number of roles. We weren't the Chief Counting Officer, or the Chair wasn't, but we regulated the parties. Mary did the guidance to the counting officers, where we would do it at a UK level. It sounds very complicated, but
it was actually very straightforward, yes. And it worked very well.
Okay. In order to be able to have a referendum here in Canada on electoral reform, which is something that my party is very firmly of the belief that it's necessary before we can undertake electoral reform to receive that consent, and it seems to have an overwhelming majority of Canadians that would agree that that is important before we undertake any electoral reform. But in order to do that, we would certainly have to update our existing legislation or create some kind of standalone legislation. As an example, our current referendum laws haven't kept up with some of the changes in campaign financing or third-party spending, for example. So I wonder if you could give us some advice on, with respect to putting laws in place to ensure that we have a fair and well-run referendum.
Yeah, I suppose it would be helpful perhaps to refer you to the referendum that we had in the UK in 2011, which was exactly about moving to a different form of voting for the UK Westminster Parliament. That we called it the AV referendum. We were going to move to an additional vote system if the public had agreed, but the electorate didn't agree, and so we didn't make those changes. But actually, the provisions that allowed us to move very quickly towards that referendum when there was a coalition government, the election before last, was very much based on the 2000 legislation that Andy referred to. So the framework was all there. It was just a question of specific discussion in Parliament about who should have who should the franchise be extended to, when would the actual referendum take place, and what were some of the sort of rules around that. But the basic framework was there in the legislation dating back to 2000. So I would say set up your referendum legislation before you think about the specifics of what your referendum is going to be.
Yeah, I think you need a very long answer to that question, but a short answer would be, we can send your clerks the report on the Scottish independence referendum, which we produced in December 14, which goes through the whole of the development of the process and what was done with question testing and how it was tested and the development of the legislation and the agreement between the UK and the Scottish Parliament. So that's probably the easiest way of getting it in a concise form.
Okay,
You have
thank you.
about 30 seconds.
About 30 seconds, okay. Is there, Ms. Pitt-Caithley, is there any other, in your experience having on the ground running the referendum, is there anything else that you would suggest that be required to be able to help us ensure a fair and respectful process when we undertake a referendum on this topic?
Briefly, please.
Yeah, yes, it was a very, the referendum on independence, people had very, very strong views on, but actually in terms of running it as a process, it was really quite straightforward. But a lot of what we did was focused on making sure voters understood how to cast their votes, understood their vote would count, and understood the importance of registering in advance and then turning up on the day to actually cast their vote. So there was a lot of it was fairly basic voter education, but it took a lot of effort and it was absolutely worthwhile.
Thank you. We'll go to Ms. Sahota, please.
Thank you. I'm finding this very interesting, especially my questions are going to be geared towards the Scottish electoral representatives here today. I find it fascinating that the voters in Scotland are able to work within so many different systems, and has there been any confusion caused by, the municipal level, the Scottish legislature, and then UK and the EU all using different systems?
There was back in 2007 rather. We did have a very difficult election then, and that was because we were trying to run two very different systems on the same day, with a single ballot paper for the two types of MSPs and a separate paper for the council elections. With hindsight, that was far too much to expect voters to take on board all those changes at once, all the different systems, and we did have fairly significant levels of rejected ballots. So we had an inquiry, actually. It was chaired by Ron Gould from Canada, who helped us enormously to get to the bottom of how we might refresh the confidence and trust in the system, because for us, particularly for the EMB but also for the Commission, the confidence of the voter in the integrity of the system is really critical. And so we had to work very hard to get it all back on track again, and by the time we got to the same elections a few years later, in the next round of the cycle, everything went like clockwork, and it was all really, really good, and we had a good positive experience. But that pulled us up short, I have to say. It wasn't high level, it wasn't huge numbers, but it was higher than normal. So that gave us cause to pause and to think again about how we did things. So very importantly, I would say never try to run two different systems on the same day. Have a clear distinction between two different elections, two different sets of elections, and give the voter a chance to make sense of it all, and then do some decent, sensible voter education. We have this kind of material, which is a voting guide, which every single voter gets from the Commission. It's entirely about factual information, nothing to do with political information, and voters have said that's been extremely valuable for them.
Has your Commission taken on most of the responsibility for education, or have the political parties also been participating heavily?
The Electoral Commission undertakes the national public awareness campaigns, the TV ads, the radio, the booklets we give to householders and such. We also work with what we call a lot of partners, the returning officers, because they directly engage with voters, and we provide certain products, template press releases, adverts and such they can use in various different guises. We also work with the voluntary sector and civic society, wider religious groups, whoever we can can engage because they know the people, they get to the people much more than we do, and we will provide information which they can use. We also work with political parties. Political parties obviously deliver leaflets to the electorate. We'll provide templates of ballot papers so people will see the ballot paper in the leaflet, the political leaflets before the event, so they can see what they're going to use. Because for us, good ballot paper design.
To squeeze in one more quick question because I'm really, really intrigued. I mean, it may be my narrow-mindedness, but I'm really hoping that when we pick a federal system here to change to, that it's going to be so great that all levels will want to change to that system. Have you found a desire amongst the people to, want to move towards one system because it's so great? And if so, do you know which way that desire is going? Is it the MMP? Is it the STV? Is it where?
Yeah. Most of the time, voters aren't really given a choice about the electoral system. It will be a decision that the politicians take for them. The only time we've given voters a choice was in 2011, when there was a UK-wide referendum on moving to the additional vote system. And I think from memory, the vote was about 65–70% against moving. People preferred, in that instance, for the UK Westminster Parliament, the first-past-the-post system, and not enough people were in favour of changing.
Thanks very much. Monsieur Boulris.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, et puis merci à nos distingués invités qui prennent le temps de contribuer à notre réflexion. Je vais d'abord adresser mes premières questions, peut-être mon premier 5 minutes à nos amis écossais, tout simplement parce que ici, on n'a qu'un seul mode de scrutin, un seul système depuis 149 ans, et puis
We've only really known one system for so many years, and people who believe in the status quo say that the system is too complex, complicating things would be a bad thing, that the public would be confused, unable to deal with it. But given the Scottish experience, your citizens are able to vote and understand 4 distinct electoral systems. So for those over here on our side who believe in the status quo and believe that Canadians can't sign on to this new change, I feel that the Scots are geniuses. Well, perhaps they're human beings like the rest of us. Some people say that it's difficult to have a proportional aspect to the vote. People say that it will mean there will be a multiplication of marginal, radical, smaller parties, and it will prevent the coming to the fore of stable political parties. What's been your experience since you started with this in the Scottish Parliament?
Okay, I think voters are more sophisticated than we give them credit for, and in my experience, particularly if you're setting up a new institution like the Scottish Parliament, voters are very open to considering, a different system from the normal first past the post. So the Scottish Parliament has never had first past the post. On the other hand, the public very clearly think that's still the best system for Westminster. So I think voters are quite sophisticated, can make choices. One of the things that surprised everybody, I suppose, was that when the Scottish Parliament system was set up, one of the things that was said about it was that it was designed to ensure that no party would ever have a clear overall majority, that consensus would have to be the norm, and that parties would have to work together. And in fact, in the last election, not the one we just had this year, but the one 5 years ago, there was a very clear majority for one party, and voters managed to make that work, despite a system that was allegedly going to prevent that from happening. So voters ultimately will use their vote, and if enough of them make the same choice, then they will prevail.
Merci. Je voudrais poser une question en ce qui a trait aux élections.
I'd like to ask a question relating to the UK elections from last year, the month of May. Something rather strange happened. I think it must be a bit bizarre for a Scotsman who is used to proportionality or transferable vote. In the first-past-the-post system, the results of the Scottish region were surprising or even shocking. The National Party, or the NSP, garnered over 50% of the vote, but 95% of seats. The Conservatives got 15%, and only one member. Labour had only one MP and 25% of the vote. Did the Conservative and Labour parties perhaps feel unhappy with the results of this system?
I'm sure that they did, and certainly the very statistics that you've just quoted have been used in the media here to highlight the potential benefits of having more proportional systems for Westminster. Last year was unique, I think, but it does show that in a straightforward first past the post system, in most places, getting more than 50% is going to be sufficient for you to have a very, very significant majority.
Est-ce que j'ai encore du temps, monsieur?
Do I still have any time left, Mr. Chairman? Okay, then, what did you do to keep that a link between voters and their members on a local basis? How did you do that?
I mean, the ward councillor link or the constituency link is always, I think the political culture in Scotland, elected members see themselves as the representative of the people and dealing with local issues much more than in other cultures where you would go to an official of the local government body or whatever, and they fulfil that through the desire to have a constituency. So that's why they used AMS in 1999. It was really important to keep the councillor link, the member link. STV for local government was a political compromise to have 3 or 4 multi-member wards. It reduced the level of proportionality, but it also meant that you didn't have huge electorates, and there was a possibility of people being able to understand who their elected representatives are. I mean, whether or not the average Scot understands they actually have 8 MSPs who represent them in the Scottish Parliament, I'm not sure that's the case, but certainly they'll know who their local member is. And of course the most active regional members will ensure that they concentrate, they get themselves into the local newspaper.
Thank you. We'll go to Mr. Reyes now, please.
Bonjour.
Good morning or afternoon, dear witnesses. I'd like to start by getting back to a comment made by my colleague. He was trying to be funny and say that perhaps some members here are in favor of the status quo. In fact, we agree with the fact that all citizens should be able to express their views. There's not simply one option on the table, but a number of options on the table. I just wanted to clarify that. I find that's an unfortunate situation we're dealing with here. I now would like to move to some questions. As to the German witnesses specifically, you said that there's a movement afoot of citizens who would like to change the voting system, and that in order to do that, a referendum would be required. And we find that that would be acceptable too if you want to change the voting system. What are the points that people are raising over there in order to change the system that you have, the proportional system that you have?
The civic movement who wants to make referenda about a change for electoral systems, in effect, they want to become the list candidates more responsive to electoral wishes. So typically, the closed list was replaced by an open list. The changes took place in Hamburg and Bremen, and this meant that you could also, for the members which were not elected by their constituency but about the party votes, you could also give your preference. You could express your preference for certain candidates on the party list, and so you could move them at the top of the party list. And this is the key point of this referendums or of this reform movements.
Parfait.
Very well, thank you. I'd like to know, in both of your countries, if you look at the statistics of voter turnout since between 97 and today, despite the fact that you have a proportional system, I'd like to get back to my colleague's comments across the way, she was saying that we would like to have more people involved, that the system is so strong that people would be convinced that every vote counts. Everybody that's in favor of the proportional system say that every vote will count if we chose a proportional system. But when you look at the statistics in every country, we see that at each election there seems to be a decreased turnout. So despite the fact that there is proportional representation, it's not translated into greater interest in elections, but rather a drop in voter turnout. Am I wrong in saying that?
Commençons par les gens d'Allemagne.
So in terms of the level of turnout, our experience has been that it's not particularly affected by the nature of the election as much by the degree to which the individual elector feels that their vote is for something important. So it's whether their vote counts not in terms of its role in the proportional system, but whether their vote has a say on something that's of importance to them. That was brought home particularly during the Scottish independence referendum, where there's a turnout of over 85%. That was unprecedented in electoral events in Scotland, and very much that was reflecting the degree of engagement that people had with the topic. So I think our position is it's the degree of engagement in the topic that's at debate rather than the process itself that affects turnout.
Donc, est-ce que je dois...
Should I gather from that it's not necessarily because of proportionality versus first past the post that there's an increase that would have an effect on the turnout? It's more to do with the actual issue at hand, for instance, the referendum, etc.
Merci.
That would be our
Okay. I mean, Scotland is probably one of the most engaged things at the moment. There is an element of tier. Academics here would talk about the UK Parliament being the first tier. Turnout in Scotland was 71% in 2015. It was only 65% in the rest of the UK. That's probably because we're very engaged post the independence referendum. The Scottish Parliament is considered to be a second-tier institution. We had 55% turnout. Local government, the last election, we got 40%. So there is a tiering effect, but there's also the engagement effect. And if people are interested in the subject, they'll come out and vote. And that's what we saw in September 2014.
Okay, we'll go to Mr. Aldag now, please.
Great, thank you. I'm going to start by just exploring a number of areas that have already been raised by colleagues around the table here, just because I'd like a bit more information. So I'm going to start in Scotland. You had talked about some of the education that's required for your various processes, and I will say that, you know, what I'm seeing this morning, we've been told there is no one perfect system, and looking at Scotland, I would think that might be the case, that, you know, different systems do different things, and you have great experience with it. So on the communications education side of it, could you provide any comments on what's involved? Like, I know that there were some slides that we skipped over, but I'm particularly interested in things like budget and timeframes. You know, you talked about partnering, that the government has a bit of a lead for some of it, but and I don't know if you can actually quantify like percentage of an election's budget that goes to communications and education, but, you know, what kind of resources go into educating the public on all of the different systems, and then what kind of timeframes? Like, is it an ongoing part of the dialogue in Scotland, or is it, you know, during the writ period is when you actually get in and talk about it? So if you could talk a bit more on the education and communications.
Yeah, I'll start off, and colleagues may want to chip in as I go along. I think it's accepted firstly in Scotland that public awareness education is important, and the Scottish Government have always helped fund that with us. On average, take the local government elections next year, we will spend approximately £1.5 million on the public awareness campaign. Much of that will go in paying for television time. We tend to use recycled creative ideas, which means it's cheaper for the TV and radio ads. And cut through in terms of messaging via the television is very successful, but we also underpin that because you can't really get beyond the high-level messages in a TV or radio ad. The key messages about how to complete a ballot paper are best done through the household leaflets, which we deliver to every household in Scotland, the partnering with civic society and anyone else we can find who actually engages with people and is prepared to help us do that.
Sorry, if I could just jump in. So things like the leaflets, do they go out, when you're actually into a campaign? Is that the timing for it? So for this specific campaign, this is the process that's being used, and this is what you need to be aware of?
Yeah, and what we tend to find is, although we have long-term information on our website and we share with other people in various ways, the time when the electorate's most engaged is near the electoral event. We would normally typically issue our public voting guide about 2 weeks before the close of registration deadline. That's 12 working days before the electoral event, so we can get registration messages through to people. We will also have the TV ads would start then, and we'd ramp up towards the electoral event and move from a registration phase into a how to vote phase, so that the messaging changes.
And on that,
the only thing I would add is that.
Oh, go ahead.
Sorry, the only thing I was going to add was that our schools have taken a role recently in making sure that particularly young people who now have the vote in Scotland at 16 and 17, so students in schools, students in colleges and at universities, have a clear understanding of the importance of registering and then casting their vote. So the schools have been very positive about doing this, and that's been a very successful part of the process. So when you're bringing 16 and 17-year-olds into the franchise for the first time, I think it was important that we dedicated some time to that. But they would not necessarily read these sorts of leaflets, but they'll certainly pick up on the stuff that's online, the Twitter messages and the Facebook messages. So all of that is very important social media material, as well as the more traditional printed leaflets.
Social media and digital advertising, we go big on that now, and over the years we've moved much more into that as people become much more internet based. Mary was talking about the hashtag Ready to Vote campaign. We basically got nearly 80% of all schools to run registration and how to vote sessions with the children, young people who are 15 through to 18, who can vote now for Scottish Parliament and local government elections.
Merci. Alors on va lancer la deuxième ronde.
Thank you. We'll now begin the second round of questions and answers with Ms. Romanado, please.
And I didn't have enough time to ask our colleagues from Germany some additional questions last round. You mentioned in your proposal that because of the smaller number of seats in our territories and 2 of our Atlantic provinces, that they would actually maintain the current system of first past the post. Is that correct?
That is correct. That was our proposal, and we just wanted to point out, we called our proposal a model because we just wanted to point out that one needs to make a decision on this question.
Okay. No, it's actually quite helpful, because what I'm trying to understand is the application of something. So this actually helps quite a bit. But one concern is here in Canada, if we were to tell 2 of our Atlantic provinces that your vote is not going to be counted the same way as your sister provinces, I don't know if it would fly, to be honest. So I'm not sure how applicable that would be, given the current culture.
Absolutely, I can understand the problem, and another solution would be to put the 2 Atlantic provinces together with the other 8 provinces, which would be an option. But since we just wanted to make a proposal, we did not want to draw the line between the provinces and territories, because we thought we wanted to indicate that there are other options. But as you say, the decision is political at another point.
Okay, and actually my colleague next to me just said a cute comment that we could put the 3 territories with Nathan's riding, my colleague from BC, and he'll have a really large one. I wanted to talk a little bit about, we did talk about education, but I want to drill back a little bit in terms of, I know that there's outreach through the electoral commission in Scotland, and you did talk a little bit about your schools, the 15 to 18-year-olds who are coming up in election. But if you could explain in both Scotland and in Germany, the actual, in your education, in your schools, what kind of civic literacy, are there specific courses that children in grade school or middle school are being subject to, so that right from the get-go, from a young age, they have some civic literacy, or is it strictly the role of your electoral officers?
No, I would say over the last 2 or 3 years, schools have taken on much more of a role in this area, and particularly we've engaged with the directors of education for each of the local authorities, with school leaders Scotland, so they represent the head teachers, and with the educational establishment, who are very keen not to get involved in anything which could be construed as party political or less than impartial, who are very keen not to get involved in who people should vote for, but just absolutely focused on making sure that people understand the importance of voting in a democracy, understand that people need to know that before they can do that they have to register, so they understand the whole process. And so it's very much about, as you say, civic literacy, understanding the role of voting and understanding how it happens. But equally, because these are educationalists doing this, we are very clear that, like ourselves, they can't get involved in anything at all that would tend to suggest they favour one party or one side over another, for example.
Okay, perfect.
And that was particularly during the referendum, because if any teacher or educationalist had been able to be accused of promoting votes for or against independence, I think their career might have been over. It would have been a very difficult area for them to get involved in.
Perfect. And in Germany?
In Germany, the political system is certainly part of the subjects which are treated in school, including the elections, of course only the election for the particular state, which is where the school is, and also the Federal Election Authority produces a lot of material for the federal elections. Then each state has a state electoral authority. They produce the material for the elections of the state parliaments. And so I think the efforts in Germany are very similar to Scotland.
I would add some special experience which depends or which refers to the referendum and the electoral system change which took place in Bremen after referendum. The other thing which was changed simultaneously was lowering the voting age to 16. And this provided a very interesting opportunity. So the teachers were able to teach the new electoral system to the pupils. And this had the effect that the turnout of the youth was significantly higher than it is normal.
Thank you.
And I think
Thank you very much. Once again, I'm going to be going to Professors Behnke and Pulkosheim to ask a couple of questions. One is to follow up on Ms. Romanato's question. She asked about Newfoundland and Prince Edward Island. You did not attempt to run your simulation in those two provinces for either the 2011 or the 2015 elections, but I get the impression from looking at the numbers that had the mixed member proportional system been in place in those provinces, in those two elections, the actual seat count would have come out being very similar to what it actually was under the first past the post system. Is that a generally correct statement? I know I'm asking you to say something without the ability to calculate it, but is that, does that seem like a generally correct statement?
It's generally correct. The results would have been very similar, a bit slightly different. We didn't include it in our brief because we didn't want to swamp you with too much prints. But of course, you can do it easily, and we did it. What we presented to you just shows the option of including provinces, small provinces with low district magnitudes into the first category group, but whether to do so or not needs to be decided at another point.
All right.
But we have made the calculations, and the seats would have changed from 7200 to 511 in Newfoundland and Labrador, for example.
Right.
So similar.
All right. That's helpful to me. I must say, I realize you don't want to make political comments, but I think it is correct that in Canada, people would feel most comfortable with a single electoral system across provinces, even if its implications were less proportional in some of the smaller provinces than in the larger ones. I wanted to ask as well about the issue of overhangs. You mentioned the example of one of the Länder in the former East Germany, and how one party had 35% of the vote, but 50% of the seats. We have some very extreme vote swings in Canada, and I wanted to give you some examples. In Ontario, in the elections of 1993, 1997, and 2000, in each of those three elections in the province of Ontario, the Liberal Party won literally or almost literally all the seats. When I was elected in 2000, for example, I was one of 3 non-Liberals elected in Ontario. Out of 103 seats, they had 50% of the vote. Similar results, in fact, even more extreme results were obtained in 1993 and 1997. Similarly, in Quebec in 1980, the Liberal Party won all but, if memory serves, all but one of the seats, maybe all but 2. And there have been some other similar examples where the Conservative Party has won all the seats in Alberta. The question is, does your model, how do you deal with that kind of extreme disproportion? One party gets half the vote, but literally all the seats. Would that be corrected for in your model? And if so, what would the list versus seat total look like in one of those provinces?
The 2 past elections where we looked at did not show any problems like that. Maybe former elections would, but the system now which we propose does not produce overhang seats, but if a party is overly successful with constituency seats, then the seats will be transferred from the competing parties to this party with the excess success in the constituencies. That's, by the way, the same problem that is used in Scotland. It's defined with a different wording in the law, but with this provision you do not have overhang seats, and when you do not have overhang seats you are in a position to honor the constitutionally mandated number of seats per province and district, per province and territory. So whether there are problems one should probably look at older elections too, but we only had a limited amount of time, and so we restricted our evaluation to the last 2 general elections.
Thank you. Mr. Cullen, please.
Thank you very much, professors.
Thank you, Chair. A couple of questions. I wanted to understand impacts, if any, we've seen in Scotland or Germany around lowering the voting age to 16 or 17 and then 16. In terms of voter turnout, any research that you've done to see what impacts have been and what type of resistance you faced. I proposed a bill in my first term in Parliament to do such a thing, and we actually had a coalition of Conservative and a Bloc and a Liberal go on tour with the bill in Canada, but there was a fair amount of uncertainty amongst Canadians as to making such a move. What results have we seen, if any, in Scotland so far, and Germany as well after?
The independence referendum in 2014, 16 and 17-year-olds were given the vote, It was a very engaged electorate, and there was thought to be well over 90% of 16 and 17-year-olds registered, and very high levels of participation in terms of voting. The Scottish Parliament, we're about to publish our report on the Scottish Parliament next week. We have, through opinion polling of the age group, found that very high levels of registration again have taken place, and claimed turnout is well into the 70%, which of course is higher than the actual turnout, but that's a common phenomena. But the electorate, the 16 and 17-year-olds have been very interested in registering and voting, and that's seen through the activities in schools.
Yes, and I would say that anecdotally it's been welcomed here, and there was some disquiet that in the Brexit referendum earlier this year in June, 16 and 17-year-olds couldn't vote. Yeah. And there was a very specific debate in the House of Commons and the House of Lords about that. I'm sure that would be of interest to you to read those debates, but in the end of the day it was decided that they wouldn't have the vote, although the Lords did suggest that there was a good idea. So there is now a bit of confusion in that 16 and 17-year-olds up here have the vote for some elections but not for some others, and that is not ideal, I think.
So, if I understand the German case, it's by some levels of government in some regions that the voting age is not uniform across levels of German politics. Is that correct, or do I have that wrong?
No, that's correct. The voting age differs on the state level and on the local level and on the federal level. So on the federal level it's 18 years, but in Austria it's 16 years, and so there is a permanent discussion going on whether we should lower it to 16 years. So far any attempt in this direction was not successful in the Bundestag.
So perhaps not for today, but if either of you, speaking to our professors from Germany, have any evidence as to what the impact has been, because you have this neighbor running an example of a lower enfranchisement age, that would be interesting to us. Turning back to Scotland for a moment, about the education component of changing systems and how vital it is to engage particularly young people, regardless of if they're at voting age or not yet, because they'll inherit the system. What efforts were done? What advice would you have for us in speaking to young people about whatever determinations we make?
I think what we tried to do was, interestingly, 17-year-olds are easy to find because they're all in school, or the vast majority of them are all in school. So we worked with the educationalists at both the local level and the centre to help teachers undertake registration drives because you can register online now, and also explain how to vote. We also, for about this 8% of 16 and 17-year-olds who are on informal education in Scotland, we worked with Skills Development Scotland to get messages out, and we arranged for tweets to be sent to that cohort, which actually led to a response of good registration level.
Thank you.
I think
we have about 15 seconds left. Can we go to Mr. Thériault? Yes. Monsieur Thériault?
Oui, merci.
I'd like to follow up on the issue of lowering the voting age. Education is a provincial jurisdiction, and education budgets are handled by the provinces. If the federal government decided to change the voting age, that would lead to changes in areas of provincial jurisdiction. There would have to be an increase of funding within the curriculum so that youth could learn more about these issues, and that could lead to some problems. That said, that's basically what I wanted to say about the issue. Now, after hearing what our expert witnesses have said, I have gleaned a number of nuances about the matters at hand. When it comes to the matter of mixed member proportional representation, we've heard that that it will or won't raise the level of voter turnout, that it is or isn't significant, that there will be more ideological plurality, and I think that is absolutely the case. But changing the electoral system depends on the values we use as foundations for our democracy. When it comes to ideological plurality, and I'm addressing my question to our German witnesses, how should small parties within Parliament be treated? We've heard about the 5% threshold. You said earlier that these small parties have the same rights in terms of participation on committees and in the chamber. Is that true? Or are there other differences, like we have in Canada now, when a smaller party, like a party that has 10 MPs elected with 20% of a vote, or with 20% of votes are excluded from parliamentary committees? Don't you think we should change the procedure for that, even though we have to operate under a very strict deadline? In your country, the smallest party, does each of the members of the smallest party have the same rights as other parliamentarians?
They have to reach the 5% threshold. So, but I think this is a very important point, because it is connected with the point of strategic voting. So what I think is the most important fail of the first past the post system is that it discriminates between votes dependent on the preferences which is expressed in the vote. And the first past the vote system, the design is intended to avoid strategic voting, that is, that some citizens give their votes to parties which are not the really preferred party. Without this strategic adaptation to the electoral system, plurality systems couldn't produce the desired manufactured majorities of a single party. But in other words, this means that the cost of a sincere, truthful vote, which is in accordance with your true preferences, depends on your political convictions. If you are in the happy situation that your preferences is for one of the candidates of the two biggest parties, your cost of casting a truthful vote is equal to 0, because this is exactly what you should do. But if you are a member of the Green Party in most constituencies, the cost of a truthful vote is high, because for a truthful vote you have to sacrifice your only chance to have any impact on the electoral result. The point is, there's no system without strategic voting, and strategic voting is needed to make systems function in the way it is intended to function. So to give the voters of small parties a chance to be represented, we have a level that is small enough, 5%, but it's also high enough to prevent a total fragmentation of parliament.
On comprend de toute façon.
You have 20 seconds left. We've come to understand that no matter what the electoral system, there will always be ways of doing strategic voting. But I would have liked to hear more about the matter of accountability at the end of politicians' terms. Perhaps my colleagues will be able to ask the question, and what effect that has on electoral dynamics. Because here, we change government regularly, and the government is held accountable. But in a coalition government, I'm sure that one group could remain in power from one election to the next. So there's not so much of an alternation between various governments. Thank you, Ms. May.
The witnesses, I know it's difficult testifying by video. We're all together here and looking at you disembodied on our screens. But I want to try to pursue the issue of closed party lists, first with the German academic team and then with our friends from Scotland. And thank you again for taking such time and care to try to apply the German system to a Canadian model, hypothetically. It's much appreciated, and I know it must have been a lot of work. Looking at page 6 of your brief, where where you describe what we would do to fill the party lists, that you suggest the seats left may be filled from closed party lists. Closed lists encourage parties to promote social cohesion and to include underrepresented groups. Now, as you probably suggested, you're experiencing Germany, that some people don't want to know that the lists are closed. They want some access to them. And I wanted to ask particularly how, if you must be familiar, of course, with Baden-Württemberg and their use of people who were on the constituency lists and failed to win a seat, but had done very, very well, and that they become, as I understand it, the party choice to fill those seats. Do you have any observations on how that works in practice?
Baden-Württemberg is very complicated, but the point is, in Baden-Württemberg you have something like an open list, because there's only one vote for the constituency seat, and the parties who had not gained constituency seats, the list is constructed in accordance with the percentage of the votes the candidates have won in the constituencies. So the most successful candidate of the Greens, for example, was the first who got one seat, and the second successful, the second seat, and so on. The point is, if you want, for example, take in the women representation, the list is the best opportunity to force every party, for example, to give the half of the seats to the woman. There exists no enforceable quota in Germany. The quotas are all informal. They are voluntarily commitments of the parties. But the party which had this commitment was the Green Party, and they have a quota of 50%, and they always have the biggest share of women. In Württemberg, where is something like an open list, the Green Party has the biggest share of women in parliament, but it's only 40%. In the other lands, when there are lists, they have 50%.
So the tension, and you may or may not know, I am the Green Party member of Parliament on this committee, so I can stay friends with my German Green friends. But there's a tension, is there not, between a closed party list as a way of promoting social cohesion, inclusion of women, inclusion of minority groups, and a public sense that perhaps this is party cliques and insiders who don't have the same rigors of running for election. Is that tension felt in Germany?
Yeah, that tension is felt in Germany, but it's not viewed as something bad or indecent.
Yeah.
In fact, that parties, it's the interest of parties to make sure that their leading personnel is seated in Parliament, and there's nothing wrong with it, I think, in the public opinion in Germany.
Thank you. Turning to Scotland, because you also, for the Scottish Parliament, use a closed list system. Are there informal or formal quotas around inclusion of women on that closed list? And in general, how is the list system regarded to the Scottish Parliament?
In terms of diversity and women on lists and such, there's nothing in the electoral rules which formally require it. It's been really left to parties to try and deal with that and create a more inclusive representative parliament. Parties have tried to do various devices to ensure a better representation amongst women. For instance, the Labour Party in the European elections requires the list to be female-male, female-male, going alternating down the list. In the past, in the Scottish Parliament election, again, the Labour Party, from memory, used a thing called pairing, where it was in the early life of the Parliament when the Labour Party was winning a lot of the constituency seats. They paired two constituencies, and they had to be winnable constituencies, and the party required one candidate to be a male and one candidate to be a female.
Thank you.
But all these things are really left down to the parties to decide.
Mr. de Courcy.
Thanks very much, and I apologize if I missed this in earlier conversation. In Germany, with the closed list, I understand well that it's common for candidates to run in a riding and be on the list. Must they do both, or is it a matter of choice for candidates, or in the way parties choose candidates?
It is a matter of choice, but actually most candidates are constituency candidates and they figure on the list. They have a list position. There are few exceptions. For example, the president of the Bundestag has no constituency because he finds, or I guess the idea is that campaigning in a constituency is so outspoken for his party that it would be detrimental to continuing being president in the next legislature. So there are few leading politicians who are only on the list, but most other politicians are on both. They are constituency candidates where they live, and they are on the party list of their state where they belong to.
And in Scotland, effectively the same question: is it a can or a must or a do? Candidates appear on both a party list and running constituency.
It's a can. You can stand in both. In Wales, you could, then you couldn't, and they're about, I believe, change it to you can. But it really depends. Some parties choose not to because of the way the pattern of votes. The Scottish Green Party, for instance, in the recent Scottish Parliament election, only stood in 2 constituencies, but it stood in all the lists. It depends where your concentration of vote is.
And the parties change their position as they see their support changing. So the Labour Party, originally you had to choose, if you were a Labour candidate, whether you wanted to be a constituency candidate or on the regional list. You couldn't do both. But in the last election, Labour was content to allow candidates from their group of candidates to be on either or on both at one time.
I'd say also that the names of the list candidates do not appear on the ballot paper. So all that's on the ballot paper is the name of the political party. Right. The names of the list candidates are displayed separately in a poster in the polling place.
So is it largely then a matter of internal party policy, whether or not they have candidates running constituency and on list, or is it a bit of a mixed system even within the different parties?
It is mixed between the different parties, and the parties' own positions change. So, I think there's now no party that says it will not allow a candidate to be on both. But ultimately, we're not really party to how they go about making their selections. But it would appear to us that they are now all comfortable to have people appearing on both. So, for example, our current First Minister was originally elected twice to the Scottish Parliament as a list MSP, and only at the last election, before this one, did she come on as a constituency MSP.
Very good. Can you maybe expand on some of the issues that you've talked around with the STV system for council elections, and the size of, the number of members per ward? I got the sense that it has caused some consternation around the relative proportionality represented by the different members. What's the conversation around what the size of the wards should be relative to what they are?
Okay, we have normally had, until we introduced STV, had a system whereby each councillor would have a relatively small ward to cover, unless you were in one of the more rural areas like the Highlands or Argyll and Bute and the Islands, where you might cover a very large geographical area, but your constituency in terms of electors wouldn't be huge. So moving from that, with a very, very clear link between the constituency and the councillor, the ward and the councillor, to something where there was less of a link, it was clear to us that to get to something, it was clear to the politicians rather, that to get to something that was very proportional would have created wards which were too big and unwieldy and unmanageable for a councillor who doesn't have an enormous support system behind him or her. So they restricted it to 3 or 4 members. So most wards, well, all wards are either 3-member or 4-member. And that means that they're not as proportional as they might be if you'd gone to 6, 7 or 8, but they're much more proportional than something that's just 1-to-1. But the wards end up not being too unmanageable, and it's worked relatively well. The members in a ward are encouraged to act together, to signpost constituents or to each other if they're going on holiday, for example, or if they're off sick, and they're encouraged to do that. They don't all do that, but there's a fair number of them who do, and it means that. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Okay, Mr. Richards, please.
Thanks. Question for our friends joining us from Germany, and I'll leave it to you to decide which of the two of you would like to answer. In regards to the overhang seats, so how are they chosen? Like the people who would sit in an overhang seat, are they chosen from the party list, or where would they come from if and when overhang seats are required?
The overhang seats are constituency seats, or at least the persons, because overhang seats come into being if the party has won more constituency seats than it is entitled according to its share of second votes, party votes. So this party gained no list seats. Has no list seats. So all seats are constituency seats, and you cannot identify the overhang seats. So you cannot say there's a specific seat which is an overhang seat. You only can say this party has 3 mandates more than it would have gained according to its share of second votes, but you don't know which 3 seats these are.
I guess I had misunderstood. I had understood them to be seats that were provided to other parties in a proportional way to compensate for where one party has. So I misunderstood. It's not exactly a simple system. It's complex, and I guess I misunderstood. So thank you for clarifying that for me. Now, in terms of the fact that you've got some members who are chosen in constituencies and others who are chosen from a list, you had mentioned, I believe it was in your opening remarks, about the idea that those from the party list still have, do constituency work. In other words, you mentioned office hours in specific that they hold, and I'm wondering how that's determined, how it would be determined where their office, like what district or what location they would have an office, for example, where they would attend kind of local events or have meetings or door knock. Like, who determines that? How is it determined where an office would be located for a member that's chosen from the party list, and where they do their constituency work?
It's very simple. It's determined by nature. People live somewhere, and so these members of parliament also have a place where they live and where they are active, and that's usually always the place where they are also politically active in that constituency which belongs to their residence.
Okay. So that was kind of what I assumed, and I think it draws sort of something that I would see as maybe a potential concern in this type of a scenario, especially given that they would be both a constituency candidate in many cases and also on a party list. So what could obviously transpire in a number of cases would be someone who's, the voters in a certain area have decided that this isn't the person they've chosen to be their local representative. They've chosen somebody else. And then, of course, the person makes it in as a person on the party list rather than as someone that local voters have chosen. And then, it would set up the possibility, and I sort of want your opinion on this as whether this is a possibility, that, and I'm not mistaken, what this possibility I could see would be that then you've got the second place candidate in a riding deciding to sort of conduct over the course of the entire term of office, sort of a campaign, I guess, to try and make sure that they're successful in that constituency in the next election campaign. So it almost becomes like an ongoing election campaign where two people who've competed in an election continue to compete, and therefore, I think it would sort of, it's something in Canada I know that voters want to see avoided, is this idea of a ongoing or lengthy campaign like we sometimes see in some other countries. Is that something you see as setting up a possibility of happening?
In fact, there is this possibility, but that political competition is going on always, and in this case it's going on in the constituency. A couple of years ago, my constituency in Augsburg had actually 5 representatives to the Bundestag, and we have 5 parties at that time, caucuses in the Bundestag, so we had in that particular constituency we had a representative from every party in the Bundestag. On the other hand, there were other constituencies in the country that only had one representative, namely that constituency winner, because the list people in that state happened not to live in that constituency. But no problem. I cannot report any problems.
I suspect that might be a problem on its own as well, where you've got some where you've got multiple people and others where you've just got one for the constituency. I suppose that also could be considered a problem in itself. Yeah.
OK. Alors, on va poursuivre avec Mme Sauta maintenant.
Thank you. I've actually asked similar lines of questioning from other witnesses before. I do find what Mr. Richards is talking about very interesting because more people tend to live in the more urban populous areas, and then if you do end up having more representation in those areas and then lack in the more rural areas, that could be a problem for some constituents. So we're trying to solve a problem of making sure that everyone feels their voice is heard and they're represented. And an important aspect of that is to have local representation that you can, hopefully be able to have within a certain reach and be accessible to you. So how would you, it seems like you're saying that in Germany the problem occurs, but people don't find it to be a problem. Here in Canada, having the system we have right now, it's, riding based, and everyone has a local representative that you can identify easily because they're within certain boundary. How would you see us, being able to keep that intact or fairly intact with any system that we move to?
Well, I think in Germany the situation is such that everybody has a constituency representative that is easy to identify, namely the constituency winner, and maybe a second and a third constituency representative, which may be not so easy to identify, but they are very visible and it's hard not to recognize them.
Okay.
So it works.
Okay. My next question is more about we want to make sure that these list representatives and the other representatives have an equal amount of legitimacy, and I have heard from you that there hasn't been a problem with people finding them to be legitimate. In this past election, I did hear a lot of comments from people saying, oh, wow, this having nominations take place before a candidate is chosen to run in a certain area was a great idea, and it really seems that you deserve it. You won this nomination before you actually ran in the campaign as a candidate, and so there was this extra legitimacy almost that people were giving the process. Is there a certain nomination process that parties have in place to choose the list candidates or to choose even the constituency candidates for that matter? What are the different processes you have in Scotland and in Germany that the parties may engage in order to give that legitimacy to the candidates?
Yeah. Oh, yes. The nomination process is highly structured, both for the constituency candidates. There are delegate conferences within each party to choose the constituency candidate, and there are legal prescriptions how a party must, which a party must follow in order to set up the list, which is a kind of hierarchical system. It starts on the bottom. There are small delegate conferences of party delegates. Then some of the small meet on a higher level, and the highest level, because the party lists in Germany are state lists, is then the state conference of the delegates of a party. All this must be properly documented and submitted to the federal election authority in order to be admitted to run at the election.
And these delegates, what voting system do they vote under? Do they have like one vote per delegate or member or whatever you want to call it, or what system do they choose amongst the different parties that you may have?
Yeah, that's up to the party. The party can decide on how they do it, but they have to properly document it, and they have to submit these minutes to the electoral authority. There's no legal provision how within a party this decision process has to go.
The legal prescription only says the procedure has to be democratic.
Yes.
And from Scotland, can I hear from you on this?
Yeah, so it's a similar position in Scotland where it's up to the parties to select their own candidates, and they'll do that in different ways. The SNP, for example, do use STV, use a proportional system themselves to select the candidates that will stand both in the list and for constituencies.
Thank you very much. We'll go to Mr. Boulris now, please.
Merci, Monsieur le
Thank you, Chairman. I now have a question for Germany. I'd like to ask you a question about the political culture that the proportional representation might be attractive to. There's a professor from California, Mr. Liepard, in his work, he says that the proportional representation system leads to more consensus-based governing, means that people work together, find compromise. This is something that is well regarded, as opposed to a first-past-the-post system where, over a 4-year period, you can have a bulldozer-type approach, as I would say. Just to shed light on the German system a little bit, perhaps you could tell us how political parties operate before the elections, after elections, and how they manage to form coalition governments or work together.
Okay, Leipert and his consensus democracies you cited. I think the political culture in Germany is really consensus-oriented. So most laws in the Bundestag are given a pass with a great majority of most parties. There is seldom the case that the majority of the governing coalition is the one which passes the law alone. The coalition formation is not really so complicated in most cases because we have something like proto-coalitions or pre-coalitions in the campaigning, in the electoral campaign. So typically the parties, they signal with which parties they want to build a coalition, and if this coalition is possible after the election, it's automatically the default coalition. And it's because in many cases people say the fault of proportional systems is people don't know what coalitions they will get. This is in reality not the case, because in most cases they get what they voted for. Sometimes the pre-coalition which is announced in the campaign isn't possible after the electoral result. This gives a big problem for the parties, but again, Baden-Württemberg, we have now the first coalition of the conservatives, but in reality it's a coalition between the Greens and the conservatives, and it's the first coalition of this kind in Germany, and it took no longer to build than the typically coalitions which are signaled before. So we have seldomly problems to build coalitions.
Je ne sais pas si Monsieur Pukelsheim.
Mr. Wickelsheim, did you have anything to share?
No, I think that the German system is consensus-oriented, and in a way I think you see it in the design of the Bundestag, which is a hemicircle, instead of being two sets of benches which face each other, and so that you can jump each other. To jump each other is very difficult in the German Bundestag, merely because the seats are placed in the wrong way.
Okay. Oui, pour votre information.
For your information, government benches and opposition benches are separated by the distance of 2 swords width. From another era, as you can imagine, we have a different philosophy over here. From your perspective, the fact that you have coalition-type governments, does that create political instability in Germany?
That's one of the most popular arguments against proportional systems, but certainly it's not true for Germany. We have very, very stable governments. So, for example, Kohl, he reigned for 16 years, Schröder for 7 years, Merkel now, she has reigned for 12 years. So the stability of governments is, I think, not in question. And
thank you very much.
In some lenders we have problems, but not in the state.
Monsieur Reyes. Si.
Madame Piquet-Lee.
Ms. Piquet-Lee, you said that most people vote when they feel that their vote matters. It has more to do with the issue than the voting system used. So when you look at the statistics of the number of electors in your country and elsewhere in the world, there is a drop in voter turnout, and it might not be the form of voting that's crucial to that. There is a complex system that you have. Perhaps there is a part of the population that's not understanding all of the repercussions of the system and of their voting. I understand that your role is to propose some improvements to your system, even though you have a proportional system. Of course, it's not going to be perfect, as is the case for any other system throughout the world. I'm wondering, when you're working on these changes, before any change would apply, I would imagine there have been changes since the first time. Does that take a long time? Does it take a while before you can apply changes to the voting system? How many years or how many months do you need to do that?
Okay, as I say, something new, a new institution like the Scottish Parliament, their voting system hasn't changed. It's been the current system since it was created in 1999. But turnout is actually up. At the last Scottish Parliament elections this year, the highest number of voters ever turned out and cast their vote. So that's positive. For some other changes, the biggest change really, I suppose, has been around council elections, local government elections, where it was a very significant change from first past the post, one ward, one councillor, to the STV system. But that was introduced relatively quickly. It was proposed during the term of a council, but by the time the next election that was due to happen in 2007 happened, the change had been introduced. So we had to spend a fair amount of time in the immediate run-up to the election explaining to people that they were to use numbers, not crosses. But we also highlighted that if they did cast a vote just with a single cross, that would count as an expression of a preference for their first preference candidate, and that would count. So that helped, I think, with the transition. But yeah, it's possible to make the change fairly quickly, as long as there's plenty of time to discuss with people how they cast their vote and how they can ensure that their vote counts.
Du côté de l'Allemagne, est-ce que vous avez...
In Germany now, have you made any changes to your system? And if so, how long did it take for that to be implemented?
Well, there are two sets of changes. Some are initiated by the Federal Constitutional Court when it examines the electoral law, or in the states by the state constitutional courts, and this more or less is then amended promptly as demanded by the court. Other changes, which are more of a reform, are decided on the political level, and they take a while. I cannot quote any time span, but these reforms in the state of Hamburg and Bremen to leave the closed list and to establish a preference vote took quite a while, because also it was initiated from the outside, carried into Parliament. This may have been longer than 4 or 5 years or 2 legislative periods. I don't really know. I would have to look it up.
But you have to keep in mind that all these changes are really minor changes in comparison to what you have to decide. It was never a change between one type of system and another type. It's always a change within the proportional system, and mostly within the proportional mixed member proportional system. So the changes referred to change of of the formula for distribution of seats from Trihont to Harry Niemeyer and Sandler-Gu, or from closed list to open list. Not really essential changes, which I think is evidence that German people are content with the system.
Parfait. Donc, je comprends. Et merci beaucoup pour vos réponses.
No time for answers, but time for a question if you want to make no. Mr. Aldag, you have a final word.
With Scotland on this one, and as we've seen, you have a number of systems in play, and it seems that there have been changes. If I'm hearing you correctly, the question I have is that has every one of the new systems that's been brought into place, or every change that's been made, gone to a referendum within the Scottish population? Or are there any instances, and you don't have to give specific examples, but are changes to your electoral system made without referendum?
Almost all changes have, in fact, all the changes have been made without a referendum. The only referendum that we've had was a UK-wide referendum on changing the system of voting for the UK Parliament, and that, as I said earlier, that was the AV referendum, changing to an additional vote system, and that was not agreed by the electorate, so the change to the system did not take place. So insofar as there have been changes, they've all been introduced without a referendum beforehand.
Okay, great, thank you. Now, I'd like to hear from both, and I'll start maybe in Germany on this one, and it's just to get your thoughts on diversity. We have heard about proportional systems contributing to increased diversity, and this is something that we're wanting to achieve in Canada, to make sure that our population is represented in our House. And if I could get, because we're going to run out of time here, but maybe from Germany first, your experience with the mixed member proportional system, do you find that it achieves the diversity that you're looking for in your elected officials in relation to your general population? And any diversity that you see, does it come through the direct elections at the constituency level, or through the lists? And then I'll put that to Scotland as well.
Well, essentially it comes through the list, but it's not formally enshrined in the legal provisions. The legal provisions provide the opportunity for the political parties to have lists with alternating placing a man and a woman, and parties make use of this as of recently. And so I would say the system provides the opportunities to do that, but it is a challenge to the parties to really carry this out in their inner party decision-making process.
It's a part of the political culture of the party, and especially the Greens, I mentioned it before, they use the lists not only for alternating women and men, but also for contingents for elder people, or for people with ethnic background, or for immigrants, for example. And it depends on the parties.
Okay, and in Scotland, your experience with achieving diversity, or do you see it happen through in the Scottish Parliament, and if so, do you see gains in diversity coming through, again, the direct elections or through the list process?
There's nothing formally in law requiring it. It's left to the parties, and they use various stratagems to try and achieve it. They're all committed to it, to achieve greater diversity and ethnicity, but it really is down to the parties to decide how they do that.
And the overall results, there must be an analysis. Does your Parliament reflect the Scottish population?
In terms of gender, not yet, but as Andy has said, all the parties have said they're committed to trying to get closer to that, and their own processes for selecting candidates are designed to help that to happen.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. Okay, I'll go back to what we were talking about previously on the communications piece, and there's two really brief pieces. One of the figures you'd given was £1.5 million. I think it was a television campaign, and what it made me wonder is, do you actually have a line budget for your elections that says, X percent of money goes to this whole education communications? Would it be 1%, 5%, 20%? That's the first piece, and then this. So maybe that's. I might be all I have time for.
I think we'd be good for an answer on that one. Yeah. Go ahead, please. Hello. Did we?
Oh, sorry. Sorry, we've muted ourselves. Apologies. Funding for public awareness campaigns at the UK level is a specific line in our budget, which the Speakers Committee, which we report to in the House of Commons, has to agree to. Funding for public awareness for Scottish Parliament local government elections is agreed with the Scottish Government, and we submit a budget. And that's how we do it. I can send you more figures on that if you need it.
Well, if it's not too much trouble, yes, if you could forward that to our clerk, that would be greatly appreciated. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank all of you for your testimony today, which was very rich in detail, and I thank you also for the attention that you've brought. That you yourselves have given to our challenge here and helping us solve our challenge. I know you did some work trying to figure out a little bit of what might work here in Canada, and we appreciate the time you've put into that. So we're hoping to have our report should be out by December 1st. If you're interested in seeing how your testimony is reflected at that level, and again, we thank you for your time today. Thank you. And colleagues, I would...
Dankeschön, Tapelet.
That's Ms. May who...
German.
Yes, thank you. And for the members of the committee, we meet again at 2 p.m. in Center Block 237C. So thank you very much. Have a good lunch. Sure. Sorry, Mr. Reid, you...
I thought we were having a meeting now to discuss the...
That's going to be at 4:30, I believe. No.
Oh, that's fine. That's my misunderstanding.
No, actually, this afternoon it's from 2 to 5:15, of which a segment at the end is for in-camera discussion.
Got it.
That's right, at 8:30. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Nobody consulted with me about that.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.